Welcome to the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast, hosted by Dawn Tura, CEO and President of SIG.
Well, folks, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Dawn Tura, and I'm President and CEO of SIG, Sourcing Industry Group. And I am so excited to bring to the studio today Johnson Poensgen, and he's the Chief Executive Officer, co-founder of Circulor. Now, this is a Future 5 company, which has been named by Sven Matters. So I really want to unpack this a little bit more and understand why it's a Future 5 and what drives their excitement in the industry. But let me tell you a little bit about Doug. So he's CEO of Circulor. He has 25 years of international experience as an executive and non-executive director, operating in TMT, financial services, IT, and management consultancy sectors. His leadership experience spans roles in large corporates such as Barclays, BT, AIMIA, scale-ups like Cadence and ISD, and startups like Snapdragon and now Circulor. He has a broad functional experience with consistent themes being innovation, both new product and to drive transformation. And he loves to deliver growth and regulation. And those are interesting to put together, growth and regulation. They seem to be counterintuitive. So Doug, welcome to the studio.
It's lovely to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me, Dawn.
Well, I'm excited to hear more about Circulor and more about your personal journey to where you are today. But before we get started, we're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. When we return, we're going to hear from our guest, Johnson Poensgen.
What is SIG University? We are an inclusive, internationally recognized university whose mission is to advance the procurement profession while enabling students to transform their careers through our world-class certifications. SIG University offers industry-recognized certifications programs, each offering a unique set of competencies and skills that sourcing and risk professionals need to be successful. The programs provide advanced training in subjects like strategic sourcing, supplier management, third-party risk management, intelligent automation, and more. SIG University is committed to academic excellence, which is why our students are trained alongside an international cohort, engage in discussion forums, and learn from senior practitioner faculty who leverage their deep industry experience with real-world case studies. Why SIG University? It was created originally at the request of SIG members. We knew there was a lot of training out there, but nothing designed around the ever-evolving skills and competencies that the modern sourcing and risk professional needs. The program was created through collaborating with dozens of industry experts to create a curriculum that is bold, fresh, and applicable to this day and age. If you're looking to advance your knowledge and your career, join us at SIG University.
So Doug, tell me about Circulor. You were named as one of the Sven Matters Future 5. And I tell you, this is a huge designation because Future 5s go on to be pretty great most of the time with our history at Sven Matters. So tell me, what is Circulor and why should everyone be paying attention to it?
So thank you. We're a technology business. Although you can probably tell from my accent, I'm in the UK where we're growing globally. We now have 5 separate offices around the world, including in the US. And our business is traceability in complex industrial supply chains. And the reason why this matters is that increasingly we've all become, we society collectively have become aware that our consumption of stuff has a significant impact both on the use of natural resources and also increasingly sustainability. Manufacturing, for example, an electric car is enormously energy intensive, basically turning rock into things that roll. And I think we're talking now a couple of months after COP26, where a consistent theme was that companies need to focus on their broader ESG impact, and particularly the inherited carbon emissions, as well as the knock-on effects of their sourcing on things like human rights. And we started this business about 5 years ago. We believed that a combination of new technologies could be applied to old problems. That's happened many times before. And we made a bet that things like responsible sourcing and sustainability in supply chains was something that was likely to become mainstream. Now, sitting here today, the start of 2022, I think most of us can agree that it is. in 2017, when we started this business, it didn't feel at all mainstream, but you have to come up with something before it is mainstream or you've missed the boat. So that's a little bit of how we got to where we are and what we're doing. Today, we work with a host of, for example, car manufacturers manufacturing electric vehicles, doing traceability for their batteries, work with oil majors like Total on traceability for the chemical recycling of plastic waste. We've done projects relating, for example, to the traceability of leather to make sure that it's been responsibly sourced. Leather, of course, is a byproduct of beef, and beef is one of those drivers of deforestation in places like the Amazon basin. So, all of these are complex industrial supply chains where the source material is completely different from the end product. And so actually tracking things through a complex network of multiple tiers of a supply chain is a significant challenge. I'll shut up in a second so you can ask me another question, but we've spent the last 15 years focusing on the digitization of the enterprise. ERP systems are common, but the reality is that, take a large car manufacturer example, their understanding of their supply chain beyond tier 1, tier 2 is pretty hazy. And yet now they're being held to account for responsibly sourcing their cobalt from the Congo and making sure there's no child labor in their supply chain, or finding a way towards a net zero target when 70% of all of the carbon emissions are inherited from the supply chain. We help companies gain visibility into those kind of challenges in areas that were previously fuzzy.
So 5 years ago, and so I'm very curious because I'm passionate about the subject of sustainability, but ESG, at least in my vernacular, didn't exist 5 years ago. Have you always been a lifelong environmentalist? Is that what drove you?
So no, I haven't always been I have a social conscience, and I actually started my career in the military. I went to places like Sierra Leone and Bosnia, and so I've seen human rights abuses, and clearly I have a social conscience. But the thread running through my career has been the application of technology to the enterprise. And I first got interested in I've always been an over-enthusiastic early adopter of technologies, many of which proved to be rubbish. But I got interested in blockchain in sort of 2016, 2017. It was like peak hype. Everyone was talking about cryptocurrencies. Unlike some of my colleagues who actually bought cryptocurrency, which I didn't, and some of them now run surf shacks on beaches in places because they don't need to work anymore. I being the nerd I am, I was going, I wonder where this might have some application beyond crypto. And that was the germ of the idea that eventually led to, well, there are challenges around the responsible sourcing of various raw materials. We all know, for example, that palm oil is associated with deforestation. We know, that cobalt is an example of, has concerns associated with human rights abuses, unsafe working practices, and child labor. We just in the last month, Congress in the US has passed a law around Uyghur labor. Very relevant, for example, to the manufacture of solar panels. The vast majority of silicon that finds its way into solar panels comes from China. So increasingly, we are all aware that responsible sourcing is a thing. Now, we weren't calling it ESG, but of course, it's rolled into ESG as well as climate protection and other issues of corporate responsibility.
So back in the last recession, 2008. We threw out anything to do with the environment. And I was in consulting at the time, and we were talking a lot about green sourcing, and green just got thrown out immediately. And it was just down to price. And I have to be honest with you, with the pandemic, when it started, I was really concerned that we were going to go backward, another 5 years and throw out everything around sustainability that we had gained, stop talking about the 17 sustainable development goals of the UN and everything else. And surprisingly, it didn't happen. And then we added, I don't know if it was the social justice movement, but we have so much more visibility and so much more passion around all of these topics in spite of the pandemic, or maybe in light of the pandemic. So do you think this is here to stay? And then I hope and pray it is. And then where do you think we're going to take it, and how will your technology help us get there?
Yeah. So yes, I remember 2008-9 very well. Obviously, the demographics of society have changed. I happen to have young children, but then we also now have millennials in the workforce, which we didn't even 10 or 12 years ago. And the younger generation is very aware of the climate crisis, and that, the things we do have ripples and consequences, and that while we all want fast fashion, it's, increasingly a theme to reuse, clothing rather than merely throw it away into landfill. And that really wasn't a mainstream source of, conversation 10, 12 years ago. Fast forward to today, we're seeing wildfires in California, we're seeing extreme weather events. There is now a mainstream conversation around, climate protection, and consumers clearly don't have access to all of the information about where raw materials that end up in their electric vehicle are sourced. But as the finance industry, and this I think is one of the key drivers of change, has adopted ESG as a criteria for investment and demonstrating the role that capital has to play in driving improvement. And we've got people like Larry Fink at BlackRock to thank for this. He's been banging this drum for some time, and credit to him. But of course, now you have people like Mark Carney and others standing up at COP26 saying we must starve the most polluting industries of capital. And I think that makes this a boardroom challenge. All of a sudden, ESG is mainstream, not just in terms of protection of brand, but also a potential driver of top-line growth. I'll use an example of that in a second with a car manufacturer we're working with. But increasingly, it will affect availability of capital and the cost of capital for your enterprise, which is an existential crisis if you can't get it right. The obvious example of that, of course, is if you or I, Dawn, now wanted to set up a coal mine, the chances are there'd be a shrinking pool of people prepared to fund it, and that the cost of capital would likely be higher. Well, you can see how that will extend into other industries that are potentially very polluting or come with all manner of other environmental concerns or human rights concerns in the future.
No, and I'm so happy to see the investment world standing behind that and realizing that companies that really take ESG seriously actually are more profitable and they're more sustainable in the long term. So you mentioned blockchain earlier, though, and I want to make sure that I understand. Blockchain, we've been watching it in the food industry, being able to trace right down to what farm your produce came from. And are you saying that you're using blockchain and Circulor? Is that one of your
so we use blockchain, or what is called a distributed ledger, is one of a number of technologies that together can help solve issues around traceability. And I'll explain a little bit more about how we do it in a second. But it is not a particularly efficient way to store a large amount of data. But what it does do is allow you to notarize transactions in a complex, asymmetric environment like a global supply chain, where there are many to many relationships at each tier of the supply chain. And what you're interested in is making sure that history can't be rewritten if it subsequently proves to be inconvenient. And that's where a distributed ledger helps. It helps to build distributed trust. Now, databases, we use Oracle databases and graph databases, are far more efficient ways of storing large amounts of data and trying to make sense of it, applying business logic, and also then as a basis for then visualizing that data. But what they can't do is prove the immutability of the records that go in. And if you think about it, pretty much any complex supply chain, except possibly food, where the time from farm to fork can be measured in days. But if you think about a mined material, battery materials are largely mined metals and graphite, or iron ore, for example. It can take 6 months from source to consumption. It's supply chain fraud is as old as mankind. We've been adulterating flour with ground stone since we lived in caves. And so actually being confident that what is claimed has in fact happened in the way in which it was claimed is a very useful thing that perhaps wasn't as easy to do before we had something like a blockchain as a tool to help us. We use a private permission blockchain, so we don't have any of the sort of energy consumption concerns that exist with permissionless systems such as that underpinning Bitcoin or Ethereum or others. We can get into the nerdy side of it in a second, but what we're doing is creating a digital twin, if you like, for a commodity at its source. That could be a 30-kilo bag of cobalt from an artisanal mine site in the Congo, or a 200-ton parcel of nickel from an industrial mine site, in, say, Queensland in Australia. And then following that material on its journey. Now, the challenge with the journey, of course, is the material changes many times. It's not like tracking a diamond, which has a unique set of physical properties that you can measure scientifically at a mine site, and they have the same properties at the other end of the supply chain when the diamond has been cut and polished, but still exactly the same thing. In this case, you're talking about ore that goes into a smelter, that goes through various forms of chemical refining, is amalgamated with other materials to create, for example, cathode material that's coated on copper film that eventually becomes a battery. So you've got multiple physical and chemical transformations of those materials, because they're essentially ingredients. I often liken this to a cake recipe. So much flour, so many eggs, so much sugar goes through a defined mixing process, spends an hour in an oven and comes out the other end as one cake. Imagine that happening many, many times through the course of a supply chain, where the cake is now an ingredient to something else, to a different process, and so it goes on. And that's what gives this real complexity. And I mentioned other technologies. We use machine learning, for example, to look for anomalies in that flow of material. Is material being introduced from unknown sources into this cake mixture, for want of a better way of describing it? And of course, the question is constantly, is this being responsibly sourced? And if we're talking about things like embedded carbon in the supply chain, if you understand the flow of materials, you can attribute a slice of scope 1 and 2 emissions from each participant to that physical flow of materials. And what that allows you to do is build up an accurate and dynamic, near real-time picture of the amount of embedded carbon in, for example, an EV battery. We did this first nearly 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, with Daimler. And we're able to show that literally month on month, exactly the same battery for exactly the same vehicle could have up to 4 times the amount of embedded carbon, largely because of uncontrolled buying behavior in the midstream. Traditionally, procurement or supply chain professionals are focused on availability and price, and not sustainability. And increasingly now, if you are looking to drive towards a net zero target and you inherit 70-80% of all of the carbon emissions from your supply chain, you can't manage something if you can't measure it. And a life cycle assessment might give you a snapshot in time, but it doesn't give you a tool to go, why am I getting a spike here? What do I need to do differently to even out those spikes in what I'm inheriting? How can I use this information to help me engage my tier 1 suppliers in a conversation about, sourcing through different routes of the supply chain with suppliers who are using more renewable energy, for example, or shifting my freight forwarding to suppliers that are, able to operate their shipping in a more environmentally friendly way. Because if you're not doing those sorts of things, you're going to be spending a fortune on R&D to find lots of ways to turn cactus juice into something else, creating new materials. Hugely expensive to find ways to abate your carbon emissions. And a lot of it, of course, isn't yours directly. You just inherit it.
All right. So our audience is primarily procurement, sourcing,
Yep.
third-party risk, outsourcing. Where does your technology fit in from the source to disposal cycle? Where does it plug in?
So our customers are, our procurement professionals. They're the chief procurement officer or the chief supply chain officer of, for example, a car manufacturer. Mm-hmm. There are sort of 2 broad places to start. You've got the downstream actor, for example, the car manufacturer, who is selling an electric vehicle and wants to be able to, and has probably committed to a net zero target, and realizes that a large part of that problem is not their own operations, it is what they inherit. Okay, so what? Now I have to get down and dirty to tier 7 of my supply chain, which I previously had almost no understanding of, in my most polluting supply chains, and batteries is a good example, it's about half of the whole supply chain's contribution. I'm just sticking with the car example because it's one we can all rationalize. And half of that's the battery, and there are only 12 ingredients in a battery, albeit that come from all sorts of parts of the world and undergo lots of different processes. Let's start with my most polluting supply chain. And we're doing that now with people like Volvo and Polestar and Jaguar Land Rover and other car manufacturers, a number of German car manufacturers. BMW recently announced us as a winner of one of their sort of Startup 360 awards around sustainability as a key driver of their journey towards a more sustainable manufacturing process. And this is all largely because they're trying to gain greater visibility into the lower tiers of their supply chain and what they inherit. You can't manage something if you can't measure it.
Okay, now, so if I've already deployed an Ariba Coupa Zygus type platform. Do you plug in, or do I have to go into Circulor back in, or are you fully integrated into most of the source to pay suites?
Yeah, so we can now, for the vast majority of those, actually obviously focus predominantly on the relationship with the tier one supplier, which clearly isn't far enough. The supply chain beyond tier one is largely undigitized. And of course, the penetration of, for example, Ariba through, tier four suppliers doing chemical refining in China is pretty low. So what we are doing is our platform will integrate into the production management platforms of those suppliers in order to connect goods in to goods out multiple times through the supply chain. Okay. And of course is then connected into a corporate ERP system. We increasingly provide, because of the volume of data that's being generated by this flow of materials and the need to generate insights from it, while customers do log in and look at it themselves, increasingly we provide it as a managed service. Ultimately, a tool is really useful when someone picks up the phone and says, there's something going on that you weren't expecting, and this is what we suggest you do about it. Because, how do you surveil your supply chain in real time all the time? The procurement director for high voltage batteries in a car manufacturer, it has a bajillion things to worry about, and responsible sourcing of raw materials is on the radar, but not something you do every single day of the week. And so we're much closer to all that data all of the time, and it can actually flag things. And sometimes we've had customers say to us, well, we don't like that supplier anymore. What might we do? Who are you aware of that could be helping us with this, that isn't going to have that problem, whatever that problem might be?
Interesting. So you said tier 7. Does anyone actually have visibility into tier 7? Is that real?
Yes. Yeah. Our very first scale customer was Volvo Cars. And they started with the question of, how do I prove that I have no child labor in my battery supply chain? Cobalt is essential to the manufacture of lithium-ion batteries. It's an ingredient in the cathode alongside other materials like nickel and lithium. Mm-hmm. And the question was, how do I prove that I have no child labor in my supply chain? And that means going back to being able to track raw materials all the way back to potentially artisanal mine sites in the Congo to prove that these are responsible mine sites, properly run, don't employ kids, etc. So the short answer to that question is absolutely, this is now happening at scale. You cannot today buy a Volvo XC40 Recharge, which is Volvo Cars' first fully electric vehicle, without this traceability. It is included now for every single car that's coming off their production lines with their batteries. So and of course this is a journey to other polluting supply chains, other responsible sourcing challenges. But we started with cobalt. Today we're working on battery passport projects. Product passports are increasingly a topic, but in Europe, we're looking at battery passports as a way of not only demonstrating responsible sourcing, but also understanding the total embedded carbon in the battery, and as a basis for a circular economy for batteries, not just recycling them. So, the idea of giving an identity to a battery, understanding all the raw materials that went into it, the total carbon footprint, et cetera, is something that has been on the agenda for some time, and the battery passport regulations are coming into force relatively soon, which will require exactly the sort of visibility we're talking about here.
No, so I drive an EV, but it's probably 3 years old now. So you say battery passport. Is it possible to look back at a battery and retrace its steps?
Not really. Because so you can start with an end of life battery and put it into recycling, and the journey has to start somewhere. But if you're manufacturing a battery today, and we're working, for example, with battery manufacturers like LG Chem and CATL and ATL and others, with multiple car manufacturers and consumer electronics firms who are all asking the same question: where are my raw materials coming from? What is the embedded carbon in those, and how do we find a way to reduce the embedded carbon in this? Particularly with raw materials like nickel, which are massively polluting. I mean, the amount of energy required to turn nickel into a battery grade material is phenomenal. And if you do it with coal-fired electricity, you're largely wiping out the benefits of the energy transition. And of course, most folks don't know that. It's why Elon Musk, a year and a half ago, was on an investor call, I think last summer in 2020, banging on about the importance of sustainable nickel. pretty sure that there were folks listening to him going, what on earth is he talking about? But he was absolutely right. Sustainable nickel is essential to making the energy transition work effectively and make the planet better, not worse.
I agree. I love your passion around this topic, and we have so many of the major auto manufacturers as part of the SIG world. So I'm hoping that everybody listening to this, beyond the automotive, but all the other areas that have the sustainability, I hope they're all listening to this podcast saying, hey, we need to get in touch with Doug. We need to hear more about Circulor. So Doug, we are running out of time right now. So I want to invite you back because I love your passion. I love your focus, and I am passionate about ESG myself. So first off, can I invite you back?
I'd love to. Absolutely love to. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Good. And then second, if you were going to leave a parting message for people to inspire them to go on this journey, if they haven't realized how important it is, what would you tell people? What would be your parting comment to them?
So all global carbon emissions all global supply chains account for about 80% of all global carbon emissions. Making stuff, whatever that stuff is enormously environmentally damaging, both in terms of the carbon emissions generated in manufacturing, but also potentially the environmental damage in, for example, mining, or which comes from everything from tailings dams collapses to deep sea tailings being pumped into the Pacific. And I think it is now a mainstream challenge for corporations to demonstrate that they're doing business responsibly and sustainably. You cannot manage something you cannot measure. And so understanding what you are inheriting from your supply chain is now core business.
I absolutely agree. We cannot turn a blind eye to this any longer. And by putting the focus on it, I tell people that, procurement, we have $17 trillion of US equivalent dollars of spend within SIG. That spend, if it was all sourced sustainably, could change the world. Totally. And people don't realize that procurement can literally change the world. It can change the climate. It can renew the birth of the earth for our children, our grandchildren, future generations. And I don't think people understand the power of procurement.
I think this is I cannot think of another time in any of our lifetimes where procurement has been front and center of the enterprise in this way. And we've always known we had to go buy stuff, but procurement and supply chain professionals are now absolutely core to organizations demonstrating that they're doing business responsibly and sustainably. And that is, I think it's really exciting.
I do too. I love the industry that we're in, and I love the fact that we can change the world. So Doug, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for founding Circulor. It's so incredibly important, and your successes speak for themselves. Spend Matters recognized you as a Future 5. I firmly see you as being just one of those mainstream technologies that everybody's going to be adopting. So I just can't wait to talk to you soon. And I'm sure your investors hope so too, but after talking to you, there's no doubt in my mind that you are going to be mainstream. So thank you for your time today, Doug.
It's a pleasure. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you. And folks, I am talking to the CEO of Circulor, Doug Johnson Poensgen. And Doug has a message that everybody needs to hear. So I know you're going to enjoy listening to this podcast. So make sure to share it with all of your friends and colleagues. This is a message that we have to get out there. This is where we have to put on our Superman capes and realize that we really can change the world. But first, we have to pay attention to the things that are important. So with that, I'm going to sign off on today's podcast, and I'll talk to you all very soon.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Want to nominate someone for an interview? Email us at info@sig.org.